Welcome to Selling Secrets. I'm your host, Josh Gay. Join me as each episode I interview experts in their field about spy films, action movies, literary heroes, video games, and much more. Do you know what it takes to make a successful Hollywood blockbuster, a best-selling novel, or an interactive gaming experience enjoyed by millions? Let's find out together on Selling Secrets. James Bond, the name that's arguably one of the most famous in the world, the super spy and pop culture icon spanning literature, film, and games. Joining me today is a man who knows all about that name. It's the director of the upcoming documentary film, The Other Fellow, Matthew Bauer. I've actually just had the privilege of viewing the film ahead of its Australian premiere here in Melbourne on the 26th of July. Literally, I've just watched it in the last half hour, so I've got it very fresh in my mind, and I'd love to get into talking to Matthew about this film because there's so much to unpack, and I really want to pick his brains about the making of this film and how it came to be. But a little bit about the film first. It's an energetic exploration of male identity via the lives, personalities, and adventure of a diverse band of men, real men, across the globe who all share the same name, James Bond. It tackles the themes of masculinity, male identity, what the meaning of a name actually is. There's even some incredible twists in the film. Twists that you may not normally see in a documentary, such as murder investigations and stalkers, which really lend an element to The Other Fellow, which makes it stand apart from other documentaries of its kind. And when talking about James Bond documentaries, I think it's unfair to lump The Other Fellow in with other Bond documentaries, because this isn't a James Bond documentary. It's not some documentary that you would find on the making of an old Bond film. It's really a film that stands on its own, and I think it would be doing the filmmakers a disservice without acknowledging that, because it's well worth a watch regardless of if you're a Bond fan or not. And I highly recommend you go and see it in a cinema if you can, because the production values of this documentary are really high. Some of the recreations of the stories that are told in the film are so cinematic, and I think really would lend themselves to a big screen experience. So definitely check it out when it comes to your town. Don't just watch it on Netflix when it comes out. I'd highly recommend you see it on the big screen. And speaking of big screen experiences, The Other Fellow is having its Australian premiere at Cinema Nova as a part of the Melbourne Documentary Film Festival this coming Tuesday, the 26th of July. Tickets are available now, so if you head over to Cinema Nova's website, you can still grab one there. But without further ado, I don't want to talk about this film anymore without getting the man himself in, so I'd like to introduce Matthew Bauer, director of The Other Fellow, to the podcast. Matthew, thanks for coming on.
Hello, Josh. How's it going? Thank you for your very detailed intro there. Much appreciated.
Absolutely. Well, it's a real pleasure and privilege to have you on. I mean, I've been following the journey of The Other Fellow for some time now, seeing you on social media and ramping up. Obviously, you had the premiere recently at the Doc Edge Festival in New Zealand, and now having the premiere here in Melbourne next week. It's a very exciting time for you.
It has been. It's been really good. Yeah. I mean, I'm from Australia originally, and we kind of wanted to start this process kind of back on home turf. So, yeah, it's been great to finally show the film to audiences. I think I've got a real kind of kick out of it. And, obviously, there's definitely been some reactions in the audience that you only kind of realize certain things when you see it with a big crowd. So that's been really cool as well.
Absolutely. I definitely know the part that you're talking about in the film. It's a bit of a twist, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but I do want to
Thank you.
delve into the themes of the film, a bit about the making of as well, rather than just doing a fluffy promotional interview. I do want to delve into that. So without giving it
Sure.
away, I did, as I said in the introduction, I found it a really fascinating study of male identity and masculinity. Can you tell me, I guess, what inspired you as a documentary filmmaker from Australia to make a film about James Bond?
Yeah, I mean, it started kind of with research, and the biggest thing was, I contacted all these guys, and they're surprisingly hard to find because you can't really Google these people, because you get all these results about James Bond 007, and they're not allowed to join Facebook with their normal name because it says they're using a fake name. So on Facebook, they're all called JB Bond or Bond James or that sort of thing. And actually, that was my kind of first clue that there was a bit more here than I kind of thought. And basically, yeah, once I finally got in touch with these guys, it was really their stories that made me want to do this film because there were all the expected responses about, being, martini jokes and Aston Martin jokes and womanizing jokes and all that sort of thing. Um, but there was also a level where suddenly we were talking about encounters with the police, and murder investigations and dealing with stalkers, and how the name came into those things. And I kind of realized there was a much more kind of rich, almost kind of cinematic thriller territory that you could really make with this film.
Hmm.
And I think, when we talk about the stuff, there is a massive amount in there about male identity. Um, it wasn't my plan, if you know what I mean. I
Yeah.
think there's a huge amount of meaning that comes through this film, and I think even people who've seen it kind of derive a lot from that.
Hmm.
I personally think that just comes with the territory because you are dealing with people who share a name with obviously, the most famous figure of masculinity, in pop culture and in our world these days. Um, but my interest was slightly more in just the characters and the insane plot complications that result because of this name.
Hmm.
And I guess that's more as a filmmaker. That's what gave me 90 minutes of plot to work with. And I definitely enjoy reading people's opinions of it and kind of what they've got out of it. In terms of those male identity things as well.
Absolutely. Well, one of the notions that you touch on is the quiet name. Obviously, when Fleming chose the character's name originally, he was looking at the ornithologist James Bond and his book, the Birds of the West Indies, and he
Yes.
found this name that was it wasn't over the top or brash. It was James Bond. It's a quiet name, but now it's obviously become the most popular name in the world in terms of recognition, and that's a major theme. Was the theme of the name and being that sort of quiet name something that you had from the outset making the film, or was that something that you discovered along the way?
I mean, I think it ties in the sense that Fleming wanted to choose this really flat, quiet name, and Fleming said he didn't want a name like Peregrine Carruthers, which is what a lot of the detectives and kind of book heroes of those days had those sort of names.
Yeah.
And he wanted a really kind of flat, quiet name, and weirdly, names do tend to kind of go with people. There's a joke on Seinfeld at some point, which is, if I can't remember the name, it's some kind of clown name. Yeah, if you call your kid Bozo, he's probably going to be a clown. But definitely, the actual ornithologist was actually a really quiet man,
Hmm.
and the actual James Bond was this really quiet man.
Hmm.
And then, of course, when it came out that Fleming had literally stolen his name to name the character, his life became completely kind of upended. And it really affected him because he was not a man who sought attention. He was not a man. He also just wanted to be known for his life's work in the field of ornithology, which is,
Hmm.
bird science. And of course, it got completely overshadowed by that. And then, what I kind of saw in that is we then cut in our film to 60 years later and meet all these other guys called James Bond. And, even though all this time has passed, they are kind of still dealing with the same thing. And I mean, I haven't really thought about it too much, Josh, but I guess compared to James Bond, any man is a quiet man.
Hmm.
There's no way that someone sharing the name James Bond is going to lead a more exciting life than James Bond because nobody does.
Well,
And so I think in that sense, it is always going to kind of overshadow them.
yeah, true. Well, there is a gentleman in the film, a rather eccentric man from Sweden,
Yes.
who literally became James Bond. He chose the name James Bond, which is James Bond Gunnar Schaefer. I'm sure I've probably completely butchered his name, but I found his story fascinating because unlike a lot of the other people in the film who were born with the name and their parents named them James Bond, or it was passed down through generations, he actually chose the name James Bond because he was a massive fan since he was a very young child, and he almost used the character as a bit of a shield from the world after his father left him at a very young age, and ever since he's almost tried to embody the character of James Bond, that larger than life character. I found him really fascinating compared to all the others who almost had a bit of a grudge against the name.
Yeah, I mean, with him, I mean, initially I didn't want name changes in this film,
Hmm.
but it actually turned out that, if someone changes their name to James Bond, they've often got an incredibly good reason.
Hmm.
And for him, I mean, what I found most, I mean, with him, the name changes actually are kind of the icing on the cake of his story. What fascinated me the most is that he's actually someone who's changed himself into James Bond in that really literal sense. And
Hmm.
I mean, you see it a lot in the way, I kind of know you're in the kind of Bond fan online world, right? And what's interesting about it is so much of it is actually about being James Bond. You look at sort of David Zaritsky's, YouTube videos and stuff, and so much of James Bond is about wearing the clothes and actually and driving the cars and actually kind of being like James Bond in a way that you don't really get with kind of Star Wars fans. I know that Star Wars fans might do the cosplay, but I don't think it's really about being Luke Skywalker in quite the same sense. And obviously with a lot of that science fiction stuff, these people exist in a different universe, whereas James Bond ostensibly kind of exists in ours. And what I found interesting with him is, he's a Bond fan who's gone to the absolute extreme of literally turning himself into James Bond, including the name change. I didn't know what I was in for, but I literally got to Sweden and got off this train in the snow, and the Aston Martin rocks up, and James Bond gets out dressed as James Bond and says, hello, my name is Bond, James Bond. And that I find it fascinating that especially in this very isolated town, in the middle of Sweden, there's this man who drives around as James Bond all day. And yeah, what he provides is a counterpoint because, spoiler alert, but a lot of the other people called James Bond in the film don't like it.
Hmm.
And we kind of needed that counterpoint of somebody who actually loves being James Bond. And yeah, it's interesting as well, obviously, what a lot of the other characters think of him uh, as well, of like, why would you want to do this to yourself? But for him, he had very good reasons.
Absolutely, and he also has a museum to James Bond as well, where he's collected all of these incredible pieces. I mean, as you said, he's this almost larger than life character who's living the Bond life, and he's living in the memorabilia.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, what happened? What happened with him is, I mean, we all have this. I mean, I'm actually sitting in my childhood bedroom in Australia right now, actually surrounded by some of my old James Bond posters and things like that. And all of us Bond fans have got our little collection.
mm,
But through virtue of the fact he's turned himself into James Bond, he actually had so much stuff. So he buys all of James Bond's cars,
mm,
so including the hovercraft from Die Another Day. As a small aside, one of my favorite things is, as a kind of quirky Swedish Bond fan, one of his favorite films is Die Another Day, which I'm sorry is not one of the most popular amongst the rest of Bond fandom. But I think because that film takes place so much in the snow and the ice, which
mm.
is where he lives, he specifically tended towards getting things from Die Another Day. And it's not even covered in the film, but actually he's a lot of the interior design of the casino is actually, of the museum is actually inspired by the Ice Palace from Die Another Day.
Oh, that's so cool.
Because it sort of fits with the setting.
Yeah.
And so yeah, he's got the Aston Martin from Die Another Day. He's got the hovercraft. He's got the Skidoo from Die Day, but basically for him, he's bought up so many of James Bond's cars, and planes and all of the memorabilia that eventually he got the money from his actual day job, which is as a car parts dealer, and slowly he was storing so many of these cars in his car parts warehouse that it sort of overtook the building. And at some point, someone said to him, "You should open a museum," which is what he's done. And so now you can actually go visit and sit in all the cars and drive around and actually really spend this afternoon with James Bond. And it's a pretty cool place. And I hope after this film is released, it gets some visitor numbers to this random town called Nybro, in the middle of Sweden. I mean, it's a weird place for a James Bond museum to exist, but that's kind of the fun of it.
Absolutely. Well, kind of fitting because, like, as the character is globe hopping and has spent so much time in the snow, it's kind of fitting that he would choose that as a location to live isolated.
Yeah, it's an interesting interpretation. I mean, he also bases himself on Pierce Brosnan's James Bond.
I found that really interesting. Yeah, what was the reasoning behind that specifically? Did he ever tell you?
I think they're kind of about the same age, and he was one of those Bond fans who kind of had his interest somewhat reignited by Goldeneye. And I mean, you might also say that Pierce Brosnan and him just kind of look somewhat similar.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of helped his journey into becoming James Bond. Because he had this, James doesn't look like Roger Moore, but he has a certain similarity to Pierce Brosnan. And, the funny thing is, we don't really go into it in the film, but he's not the biggest Daniel Craig fan, and he says it's because he still buys all the stuff from the films. Don't worry, but he says he kind of prefers the funnier, more light-hearted, kind of Brosnan and Roger Moore eras. I personally think it's partly also because he doesn't look like Daniel Craig.
Yeah,
he looks more like Pierce Brosnan. But I think it's definitely a fun element of the film that he has this quite specific. He quite specifically bases himself on the Pierce Brosnan of Die Another Day, which is an odd direction to go in. But I think those films are starting to get a kind of renewed appreciation, so maybe he's a bit ahead of his time.
I'm definitely a defender of Die Another Day. There's half a good film in there, so
it's more fun than I'd probably rather see. I'm not going to lambast the nearly 3 hour more recent Bond films, but I'd probably on a Sunday afternoon I'd probably choose Die Another Day over 2.5 hours of plot.
Agreed. Well, moving forward from someone obviously who loved having the name James Bond, we meet several who didn't like the name. Obviously, you met James Bond, who's what was his career? He was a director of theatre in New York.
Yes,
and
he's kind of an off-Broadway theatre director. Yeah,
and he almost becomes a bit of a reluctant hero in sorts. And where the Swedish one was, Pierce Brosnan, who loved playing James Bond, they sort of mirrored each other. This New York James Bond almost, for me, mirrored Daniel Craig's James Bond and how Daniel Craig ended up viewing the character and sort of hating playing Bond. This guy too really hated being James Bond. Oh, what was the contrast between the two characters like for you?
Yeah, I mean, definitely Daniel Craig and him get juxtaposed a lot in his stories, and it's because he specifically, he's in New York City, which is a real media epicenter, and so he really feels it when a new film comes out, and so we were filming this between Skyfall and No Time to Die, and very much checked in on him at those points, and so definitely it's at the moment it's Daniel Craig who haunts him the most. And oddly enough, and again, it's quite funny. They're the same age, him
Oh
and Daniel
wow.
Craig, and it comes up in the film, and yet, they obviously, Daniel Craig with his intense workout regime, is my James Bond in the film. He looks like a 50-year-old, whereas Daniel Craig, looks like, I mean, I guess like his face is a bit 50 years old, but definitely looks like a very fit 50-year-old man,
Hmm.
let's say. And so there's that real juxtaposition between them. And then, I mean, the thing about him is because his middle name is James Alexander Bond, which means if you look for a James Bond in the New York phone book, of which there are 12, he's the first one to come up. And
Oh,
when you have
get
a name
out.
like this and you're in a massive city like this, your phone rings in all of these weird ways, and even going back to the ornithologist James Bond started getting a bunch of weird prank calls in the 1960s. But specifically, the New York James Bond gets a lot of calls to do like TV commercials, and to do like the David Letterman show as a real James Bond, and indeed calls from me. And when your name is James Bond, there's this whole kind of like sub world of people out there who, for various reasons, suddenly need a man named James Bond.
Hmm.
And weirdly enough, they kind of get these random phone calls with these random missions. And he very much is that guy in our film. Yeah.
I found it odd though how he does hate having the name and he goes on about hating the name, yet he also I think it was his husband who said in the film, he hates saying the name James Bond, but as long as he's paid to say the name, he'll say it as many times as you want. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, James can be bought. Yeah, James is always a mystery to me and to everyone in the film because he's somebody who says, "I hate it, I hate it, I hate it," but he's very happy to go on TV as a real James Bond, saying how much he hates it. Yeah, and I think he was a very willing participant in this film,
Hmm.
and I get where he's coming from. He says this at least lets me tell my own story.
Yeah.
But everyone that watches it goes, no, I think he loves it. I think he actually loves it and just says he hates it. And that just infuriates him even more. And unfortunately, it's a bit of a situation where you kind of can't really win.
Yeah.
Either way, yes, either way, you're stuck in this cycle of being a man named James Bond. Either way.
Absolutely. Well, um, going across the world and people who may not necessarily have hated having it, but they definitely had their issues with having the name James Bond. You touched on two characters in the film, both who lived in the same town somehow, which are a small town in the US, both named James
Yes.
Bond. One who unfortunately not giving too many spoilers away, is an African American man and gets caught up in a murder investigation and spends quite a bit of time in jail. And then the other gentleman named James Bond who lives in the town alongside the one that's charged with murder is having to deal with all the issues of, you know, everyone thinks I'm a murderer, even though it's this other guy, and I'm white and this guy's black. That was a really fascinating tale, which I hadn't really thought of. You know, getting whether it's pulled over by the cops and saying, "Oh, my name's James Bond," and them thinking you're lying, but the fact that James Bond Jr., the African American gentleman, that was almost a bit of a point of contention in his murder case, where they said, he was trying to have the cops on a bit as well. Can you talk to those two characters a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I said at the start, I mean, what really turns me on with this film is those plot complications that happen 4 or 5 moves ahead when you have this name. And even with the James Bond we were just talking about before in New York, it's not so much the Aston Martin jokes; it's the fact that having the name James Bond causes his phone to ring with these random people. And in the film, we then follow him once his phone has started ringing around the release of Spectre. He's then asked to do an ad for an online casino, and before he knows it, he's in Atlantic City in New Jersey, having to recite the name James Bond 100 times on camera. And the fun for me in this film is really following through of like all the crazy kind of machinations that happen because of this name. And yeah, definitely in South Bend, Indiana. Yeah, there was a guy called James Bond who was, charged and arrested, for murder. And of course, the murderer, he didn't kill someone because they made a James Bond joke or anything like that. But the film really explores then the media coverage of that event. And of course, as is pointed out in the film, there's a lot of shootings, and especially a lot of gangland shootings that happen in that town. And they often wouldn't even make the news. But because his name is James Bond, of course, it's front page news, and it's the number one story, in the town, and the number one headline on the news. And of course, the news aren't saying it, but obviously the headline James Bond charged with murder is a rather compelling headline. And of course, obviously everything went nuts in the Facebook comments and all that sort of thing. But then, of course, there's another guy in the same town called James Bond. And it's a very common name. And the other guy in the same town is actually like a right-wing Christian Trump-supporting gun nut. And he's quite known for that. And so, of course, when it comes up on the news, James Bond charged with shooting, he started getting, phone calls at his office of people kind of saying, we're very worried that, one of your employees has been charged with murder. And then he's having to explain to everyone that he is, in fact, not the James Bond. And obviously in the film, then there's a lot of machinations between how that worked out and how there ended up being a lot of kind of interplay between these two guys. But I mean, especially in that story, one of them is black and one of them is white. And then kind of seeing the kind of racial side of that as well, and how the media treated a black James Bond versus and not just the media but the police as well. I will say in this film that there's the part you were referring to where we follow them all when they have encounters with the police, and they all tell the same story, which is that if you don't have your ID, you will get arrested, because if you don't have your ID on you, the police will ask what your name is, and if you say James Bond, you end up getting arrested because they think you're trying to mess with them. But all of the white guys in our film, obviously, eventually they found out it was their real name and they had a bit of a laugh. Our black James Bond, the first time that happened to him, he ended up in prison for 60 days because regardless, the judge actually kind of said, you were still trying to antagonize the police officer.
Yeah.
And, so this guy actually, ignoring the murder, this guy actually has just been to prison for telling the police his name is James Bond. And I think, obviously we don't have a massive sample, but it's telling that it was the one black guy that happened to. And again, it wasn't what we set out to tell, but, people can read into that what they will, and they very much do when they see this film.
Absolutely. I think now I really don't want to get into spoilers here because there's an incredible twist halfway through the film. And I think it's probably part of the story that I was drawn to the most. And as I said, I don't want to give anything away because I want people to see this for themselves. And there's a character who comes up who is completely unexpected in the film. But I was drawn to this particular story because in a way it was very similar to the Swedish Bond, who used the persona of the character Bond as a shield to protect himself from his past traumas. This particular story follows a similar line, but in a different way. Why do you think that these two characters in your film used the persona of James Bond as a shield for themselves, whether it's their past trauma or for the world in general?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a tough one to talk about. The film takes a very radical departure halfway through. And to us, I think we're kind of still figuring out how to talk about it because it kind of is really what the film is about by the time you get to its final minutes. But by its very nature, you can't really talk about it because it will ruin the film for people. But I will say, I mean, I'm going back to Fleming. One of my favorite novels is The Spy Who Loved Me, which obviously follows a character for the first three quarters who appears to be completely separate from, even the James Bond universe. And as, of course, it's unfilmable as a James Bond film, and it's why the actual, film of The Spy Who Loved Me is completely separate. But, in that novel, you follow Vivian Michelle, and you follow her for, this, what seems like this almost interminable amount of time where it has nothing to do with James Bond. And then, at the moment where it feels like all hope is lost, James Bond suddenly appears from nowhere and saves her life. And I've got to be really careful here, Josh, but we found a story by complete chance of someone who is currently living in hiding, and using the name James Bond as something of a shield to protect their location and identity. And in the telling of that story, it actually requires the film to go completely off its own rails, for a good 15, 20 minutes, where I don't know, what was your, can I ask you, Josh, something's just in, what was your experience when it happened? Because were you confused?
A little bit, yeah. So, I don't want to give anything away because, as we both have said, it's a part of the film that you need to watch without any sort of preconceptions. But I was sort of, it leaves you guessing for, as you said, it's a 20-minute odd section of the film. It leaves you guessing for at least the first 5 minutes as to what's going on here and what relevance does this have to the overarching narrative. I almost had to actually check because watching the screener that you sent me, I was having to check that I hadn't clicked off and accidentally watched another film, because it does take a tonally different stance as well compared to the more lighthearted first half of the film. And I think I really enjoyed it. It was. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Well, no, I mean, me and my editor worked very hard to. I mean, obviously, this film sets up a pattern, which is everyone who appears on screen is, a man named James Bond, and part of that is actually setting you up for, that completely going off the rails. And then we had to spend a lot of time making sure the audience we had to kind of reassure the audience that this was going somewhere.
Yeah, and I really liked that.
Yeah, and I think, it's more as a fan, I love The Spy Who Loved Me so much because, the novel, the film as well, but in terms of the novel, I love how that Fleming really played on, the expectations of the previous Bond novels and kind of went, I'm going to mess with my audience a bit here. And I will say, I think, that what actually becomes the main story of the film, actually, it answers the number one question that everyone asks about being named James Bond. And I can't say what that is because it'll ruin it. But it answers that, but also it had that Spy Who Loved Me thing of basically leaving you going, what the hell does this have to do with James Bond, before James Bond appears in a rather dramatic way that suddenly makes the entire film that came before it make sense.
Absolutely. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And from, my background is working in film and as a storyteller. I found the way that you subverted expectation with that, as well as the narrative structure that you took with it. I thought that was an absolutely masterful part of the film. Let's move on, because if I keep
Sure.
gushing over it anymore, I probably will give something away.
Sure, sure. So you choosing your words and your pronouns very carefully, Josh. Thank you.
No, you're
Um,
welcome. But what do you think it is about the name James Bond specifically? Obviously, it carries connotations and a level of we've touched on the masculinity side of things and male identity, but yeah, it's a name that stands for something. You think about James Bond as a
yeah,
character, and he does stand for, doing the right thing, that archetypal hero as such. What do you think it is specifically about the James Bond name that has lasted so long and potentially has carried these connotations with it?
yeah. I mean, I don't know if it's so much the doing the right thing, just because that can apply to kind of any hero. It's really interesting with the original ornithologist James Bond. His wife actually wrote a book about this in about 1964, which is obviously just 3 films in when Goldfinger was coming out, and she even wrote then that she's like, suddenly there's James Bond toiletries and toys, and it feels like what she was detecting was the beginning of what we call the James Bond phenomena.
Hmm.
And the merchandise and the brand tie-ins, and I think it's kind of about James Bond is actually a lifestyle brand. I mean, literally, I mean, they sell products, designed as James Bond, but you look at, all of the tie-ins to, alcohol brands and cars and shoes and belts. It is a lifestyle brand in this really kind of like duty-free store kind of way that summarizes a kind of like a way of masculine living that we are all kind of meant to aspire to, or at least we're told we should aspire to as men. And I think that's it more than the actual plot of any of the films. I think that kind of image of James Bond in our world is especially what affects the characters in the plot of Goldfinger is immaterial to a man named James Bond. It's not, but it's more that if your name is James Bond, you are surrounded by not just ads for the film, but ads for all like the products associated with the film,
Hmm.
and all of those things are about projecting a certain version of masculinity. And I think that's where it lies. There was also something that, funnily enough, I'd never really thought about this in these terms, but someone wrote something in a YouTube comment recently, and I agree, is that James Bond is the only character whose name is his catchphrase.
Yeah.
Like, that his catchphrase is the name's Bond, James Bond, and it's the only. I'm sure there's another one, but Indiana Jones' catchphrase is not "My name's Indiana Jones." Luke Skywalker's catchphrase is not Skywalker, Luke Skywalker. But literally, James Bond's catchphrase is introducing himself with his name.
Hmm.
And I think kind of all those things combined, I didn't really think about all this too much during the production of the film, Josh, because for me, it's just such a given. If you know what I mean, it's just all of this is what makes sense, but
Yeah.
it's just a given that the James Bond name just has this enormous connotation to it.
Hmm.
I think it's why it wouldn't really be interesting if this film was about guys called Luke Skywalker. There's no the amount of pressure on a man that having this name has, I think, is completely unique.
Absolutely. Well, speaking about the making of the film itself, I want to get a little bit nerdy. Obviously,
Sure.
as I said, my background is filmmaking prior to what I do now. Um, Obviously, you traveled quite a bit for this film and the making of this particular documentary. Was that self-funded? Was this all made off your back, or can you tell me a little bit about how the actual documentary came to be?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, so this started as my thesis film at NYU Film School. And so we started with, you get like a stipend from them, which I think was something like 3,000 US dollars. But the bigger thing more is that when you make the film, you get to kind of use all the NYU Film School camera equipment and all that kind of thing. So a lot of the America section of the film you see was shot kind of then. And that was actually just for kind of like my kind of, 10-minute short NYU thesis film. And at that stage, it was kind of more of like a journey across America, meeting guys named James Bond. And then after that, we kind of we explored the idea of expanding it into something else, and there were a lot of ideas of could this be a web series, or could this be a TV special, or kind of whatever. And then we had like kind of a Kickstarter trailer, which eventually kind of went online. And a fair few kind of people saw that, and because of that, actually, people started contacting us with other characters, and especially like the Swedish James Bond you see in the film, we kind of discovered him through that. And then, of course, when someone called James Bond was arrested for murder, someone actually contacted us and said, "Hey, have you seen this?" And so it kind of took on a bit of a life of its own, from there. And we were making this for quite a while, but very much in small dribs and drabs. There was never a shoot for this film that cost over, say, 1,500 US dollars.
Oh, wow.
But in totality, it's made a hell of a film. It's my own film, but it's made something that really resembles a movie. But you'll see in the film, for instance, there's an entire sequence that takes place in the Second World War. It was like, how do we film a bombing raid, on a World War II Nazi army base, for instance. And those things were, me and my camera guy and an actor, with a one German army uniform. I will say the great thing about doing reenactment in a documentary, though, and this is in a real film level, is you don't have to connect all the shots, because you can cut back to an interview all the time. And so it kind of let us kind of really say pick like 10 specific shots and then kind of figure out how to do them on a budget. So for instance, there's a sequence where you have a escaped World War II Nazi, who actually, what he did was he escaped Nazi occupied Denmark and floated across the ocean in a boat to Sweden. And there's a shot of him, you'll probably see in like the middle of the ocean, on a boat. And that shot was actually, I'm actually standing behind the boat in the water there, holding it in place. And we shot that shot from the shore. But then what we did was we used visual effects to make it look like it was this boat in the middle of the open ocean, whereas the actual shot was like much tighter. And I've kind of got a bit of a background in VFX, and so it was kind of figuring out how a lot of that was done. There's another sequence which again is a reenactment sequence that involves like a police helicopter, which has this kind of massive searchlight on it, and it was kind of us kind of working our way through that sequence and kind of very precisely figuring out how to do those kind of things. But basically, after the SWAT team raid that you see in the film, you'll see there's a shot from the helicopter where there's like 10 SWAT team officers all swarming around James. I don't know if you remember the shot.
Yeah, I do indeed. Yes.
That shot is actually only one SWAT team officer, because we only had one costume. And so what we did is we held the camera still from above, and we got him to walk in towards James 10 times. And so then we cut each one of those together to make it look like it was 10 guys walking in, and then added a camera shake afterwards to make it look like, the shot from the film looks like it's this helicopter shot of these 10 SWAT team guys, but it's actually all the same guy. And so it was a lot of that sort of thing. And because we can keep cutting back to the interview, I don't need to do 5 of those shots which connect. And so we were just kind of able to get away with a level of production value and kind of having a lot of those kind of big trailer shots in it.
I love it. And you don't notice that. Like it seriously, the from viewing it, production value wise, I mean, you'd want to see it on the big screen because it looks phenomenal. Like, it looks like you had a multi-million-dollar History Channel budget to documentary style thing.
Yeah, again, I think we've gotten away with that because just on a real technical level. It's because we can cut back to the interview room all the time. The hard thing is if you do an entire police helicopter raid, you'd need like 100, 150 shots to be able to pull it off.
Absolutely.
But because you have someone actually telling the story whose interview you can cut back to, you can get away with it with just 15 really precise shots that, if you give it enough time and thought, you can pull off on a budget.
Absolutely. Well, Matthew, I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I wanted to tie this up, bringing it all around into a sort of circular story. You ended up at the end of the film, without giving too much away, you basically get to bring all of these James Bonds together in essentially what were support groups, people from all across the US or the UK. I mean, what was it like for these men who have had to deal with this name for their entire lives, or they've chosen to have this name? What was it like bringing all of these people together?
Yeah, I mean, for me, you'll see as the film plays out, there's actually a lot of trauma that goes on with these characters. I'm personally what you call an addict in recovery. I had a lot of problems with, addiction earlier in my life. And so, I've been to a lot of those kind of support groups in my time. And actually, they frankly kind of saved my life. And so I understand when people have been through trauma that often they end up in that kind of setting. So it was actually a very natural thing for me to kind of bring them together it may sound comical, but kind of as like a James Bond anonymous support group at the end of the film. And a lot of those support groups, especially during COVID, moved online to Zoom meetings, and so there's kind of a Zoom meeting version and then one in the film. And we don't really show much of what they're talking about because we kind of get, having seen the whole film, we kind of get what the conversation will be.
Yeah.
But I know that for a lot of the characters in the film, they actually did find it incredibly therapeutic, because the reason why people go to these support group environments, especially the kind of, whether it's, Cocaine Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous or whatever, is so that they can kind of speak their truth freely with people who have the same issue as them.
Yeah.
When I was, going through addiction problems, I went to a lot of kind of like gay men's meetings. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of stories from your past that you probably wouldn't feel comfortable telling outside of that meeting, because only those people might really completely understand that experience. And in a really crazy way, only another person called James Bond really gets what it's like to have this problem. I'd say I kind of get it as it's been an odd area of expertise. I think I probably get it more than most people do. But, even though they'd shared all this stuff with me, it meant a lot that they were able to kind of speak to each other and share their own stories with each other. And specifically for the New York theater director who, says he hates the name, he's actually really enjoyed the process of making this film and meeting all these other guys called James Bond, because he's now got all these other people he can talk to about it, and they all now, comment on each other's Facebook posts and, and look, at least, no matter what your problem is in this world, it's always going to help to talk to somebody else who has the same problem.
Absolutely.
And I think, through this film, it has kind of brought, the James Bonds of the world together. And, there's other James Bonds now who aren't even in the film, but who are seeing this film and hearing about it and kind of having their own experience because of that, and it's a film that, you have films about 1 million mental problems out there. This one is a very specific psychological condition. But for those people that have this very rare psychological condition, they've finally got their movie. And I think they're quite enjoying that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I wish I had a support group for people who shared the same last name as me. I think that would be a very cathartic experience to be able to talk about.
What's your last name, Josh? I only know you as Josh 007 Oz.
So my surname is Gay. So yeah, it's yeah.
How's that, Josh? Not to take over, but unfortunately,
No,
I'm normally the one doing the interviews. How's it gone for you? Serious? Are you a homosexual?
no. So I'm
Oh
a
God, okay.
straight white man with the surname Gay.
Oh,
Yeah,
fantastic.
so it was interesting childhood growing up. I think primary school children are hideous, is the best way to put it, especially in a time where gay rights, LGBTQ rights weren't talked about nearly as much,
Yep.
and it was definitely used as a weapon against me, which was not a fun thing to have. So, yeah, growing up was fun, but it is I in a way relate to the James Bonds in your film
Yeah.
because it you grow with it and it becomes a part of your identity and you use it as a tool of strength. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's been I love to say it, a lifelong journey. But I'll tell you a
Yeah.
joke with the last name. So very unfortunate. My parents, they spent a long time. They told me, trying to figure out a name that didn't go against gay and sound terrible. And
Yeah.
so my dad's name's Tony, but his actual name's Anthony. So
Yep.
he's a gay, and he was
Yep.
in the Navy and he worked on submarines at one point. So he
Yep.
was a gay sailor in a submarine full of seamen.
Fantastic.
My middle name's Anthony, so my full name is Joshua A. Gay.
Josh, you are a gay.
Yeah,
Yep.
and
Yep.
my uncle's name is Richard, so it's Dick Gay.
Dick Gay.
And my
Yes.
fiance's last name is Prissy, so if we hyphenated our last name, it'd be Pretty Gay.
It'd be
So,
pretty gay. Yeah,
it's
no,
been a
I no,
journey.
I totally get it, and it's like, I mean, I especially going through this film, you realize actually just how you don't think about it much unless you've got a weird name, but names are a massive thing, and it really does like affect the, especially because of the kind of schoolyard bullying element. It actually can have a massive effect on people's psyche and that kind of thing. I mean, there's we didn't really go into it, but there's a character in our film who actually changed his name from James Bond, and his name was James Bond. And actually, when he got married, he actually took his wife's name, which is Hart. And changed his name from that. And it really, I mean, to think, on your wedding day, you're having to think about these things. And he actually used the wedding as a way out. And it's really interesting that, yeah, you're now, with your fiance having to have these conversations. I assume, and actually going, oh God, if we have kids, we're going to have kids who are called pretty gay.
Well, that's the thing. So my partner's actually pregnant at the minute. We're due in November of this year, and we've
Yeah.
had the conversation. So our baby boy will have her take her surname, and when we get married, we're both just going to keep our surnames more for convenience side of things. So I'll be Josh Gay, she'll be Leah Pretty. Our son
Yeah.
will be Prissy. So in a way,
Yeah.
yeah, it's one of those identity
Yeah.
things
I
that
mean, pretty
yeah.
sounds pretty gay as well.
Yeah, and it's one of those
Sorry, I'm
things like
just, I'm just having a laugh with you, Josh.
no matter what, my kid's just going to be tortured for the rest of his life. So
There's a lot of masculine, feminine stuff going on with that. But yeah, I didn't actually, I do remember from a while ago seeing that, Josh. Yeah, and yeah, I think specifically, I think this film definitely as well. I think it has resonated with other people who've just got kind of funny names. There's a lot of them. A guy wrote to us. His name was Hannibal Odisho, and he said, I've had to spend my entire life with like Hannibal Lecter jokes going
oh
on, and it
god, yeah.
sounds funny, but because it happens in the schoolyard, these are really kind of formative experiences. And yeah, that's really interesting, Josh. You should leave this part in the podcast,
Oh,
Josh, because it
absolutely.
will it
It's
will
staying
allow
in
people
here.
to get to know you a bit better beyond being a James Bond fan.
Absolutely. Well, I
But
did have
it's actually really
yeah.
fascinating, Josh.
I had this conversation with David Lowbridge Ellis, who runs the License to Queer
Yes.
podcast and blog, and we discussed this quite a bit as well. So I'm very open to discussing that and going into that side of things because it's something that needs to be talked to. And yeah,
Yeah. No,
it's,
it's fine. I'll tell you one more story. There's a Dr. James Bond who you see in the film, and the kids at his school in Canada decided to call him Double O Fag.
oh god.
And it's just, just kids. That's what they came up with in his school, and they call, oh look, it's double O fag, and that's that. And he's not kids do, and obviously, yeah, they managed to combine the Bond thing with a gay slur, and
Kids
that
are
became his.
horrible, aren't they?
They are. Their kids are horrible. They really are. And yeah, but also as well, when you talk about Josh, you are a gay, I take it the other kids came up with that,
Oh,
not you.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're also just, they're very clever with their little word plays.
Yeah, considering my parents in their 30s never ticked to that. Yeah. It's
Yeah, well, I think as well, there's a thing, unfortunately, when you're at school, your name comes up a lot. Do you know what I mean? Your name is written on the blackboard. There's roll call.
yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So, there's assemblies and, choosing kids for sports teams. And so I think names come up a lot more at school. Or at least it's the first time in your life where your name just comes up on a constant basis, maybe in the same way, our names come up on a constant basis, as adults through our credit card and online information and that kind of thing. But I think school's the first time where it kind of becomes a thing. But yeah, that's
Absolutely.
very
Well,
interesting, Josh.
there's an
Very
idea for a
interesting.
sequel for you. What's in a name, and exploring that a bit further.
Yeah, men. I'm definitely not doing this. I'm getting out of the men called this genre after this, Josh. But there's definitely there's a men called gay film out there, because I would actually. It sounds funny, but you could be called the other gays.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure it's thing, and I'm sure as well. Just everyone called James Bond, and even just people called Bond, they have a bond with other Bonds because
Oh,
they understand all the
absolutely.
Bond jokes. And I'm sure you've spoken with other gays,
I've never met
not those
another
kind of
gay.
gays. It gets complicated. But I'm sure you've spoken with other people who are even within your own family, but
Yeah.
other people you meet, and I'm sure people say to you sometimes, "I know another guy called gay,"
Yep.
or there was a it has this weird way of connecting people when you have a funny name like this.
Especially when it's spelt the exact way. There's no E on the end or anything like that. Yeah, it comes up quite a bit, but outside of my family, never met someone with the same last name as me. So it would be an experience,
Yeah.
that's for sure.
Yeah, you haven't thought of adding like make it Ghey and saying
No,
that it's a
no.
German it's a German word,
I
or
think
adding an
no.
E
See, I
on the
think
end
that
even.
no, I think that takes away from. I mean, we
Yes.
go back to the whole identity side of things. It's very much something that has formed who I am, and I
Yeah.
I I, I, I don't think there would be many other Josh Gays out there in the world, and yeah, I like to claim that and stake that in the ground. I don't think I would. A little bit like plastic surgery or anything like that. I don't think I'd ever change it.
Yeah, I mean, it could always be construed as homophobic if you did, but I'm sure it's also given you a weird bond with the homosexual community, even though you are
Absolutely,
not.
absolutely.
It's funny. It's very interesting, Josh. We'll have to stop because otherwise this will become its whole own podcast. But very
Well,
interesting.
definitely. Well, Matt, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and taking the time to talk about The Other Fellow. I just want to give it another plug again. It is premiering at Cinema Nova in Carlton here in Melbourne on Tuesday this coming week. And I highly recommend anyone who listens to this podcast to head along to the premiere and support this film, because it is an absolutely incredible documentary, incredible piece of filmmaking, and anything that we can do to support not only, I mean, from the James Bond community, but to support Australian film as well, and get out and see Australian documentaries and Australian films in our own backyard. A film like this is going to have a lot of success globally, so I definitely recommend everyone goes and checks it out and puts in that bit of support for this film, because it deserves every minute and every bit of praise that it's given. So, Matthew, just want to say thank you very much again. Where can people find you online and find out more about The Other Fellow film?
Sure. If you go to Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, it's all the handle on all of them is The Other Fellows. So, Instagram / The Other Fellow. so on and so forth. Yeah, if you want to follow us on any of those, we should have some news. I can't really discuss it, but there should be some word on the European premiere of the film
Oh, that's
coming up
exciting.
shortly, and hopefully also some news about where people will be able to watch it shortly. But currently, the only place you can watch it is in Melbourne on Tuesday night at the Melbourne Documentary Film Festival. Yes, yes.
Perfect. Well, Matthew Bauer, thank you very much for coming on to talk about The Other Fellow. I'd love to get you back on to talk about the film again. But until then, really appreciate you taking the time and
Thank
coming
you.
on.
I'd love to come back for the other fellow ending explained. Yeah,
Done
so
deal.
yeah, that would be
We'll,
great. Thank you
we'll
very much, Josh.
do a roundtable discussion with other Bond fans and discuss it a little bit more.
Awesome. Thank you very much,
Perfect.
George.
Thanks, Matt. Cheers.